All right, I think I heard the announcement. It just was almost muted. So thanks everyone for showing up right after lunch. It's a really good turnout. You guys didn't fall asleep after eating, so really appreciate it. My name is Guillaume. This is Jordan. And we're going to talk to you about actual security incidents that we see and how you can prevent them from happening. So everything you're going to see today is based on real events, but it's deconstructed and anonymized and built back into a talk. And this is the first time we do that presentation at an IT conference. So we've done a Windows version of that at different security conferences, different levels and everything. But this is the first time we do it for Mac. So when we get the Q&A, feel free to give us comments and questions. We'll be happy to hear that. So we decided to make this talk because Jordan and I, we both work at Rapid7 in the services organization, but we do slightly different things, which give us a different outlook on what happens in companies and their security programs. On my side, I do more security architecture. I worry about security programs. Can you defend your environment? How secure is that? And it allows me to see a lot of different things that companies try that work, that don't work. I see people spending a lot of money on different things. Does that make sense? Does that not make sense? So that's what I do almost all day with different clients ranging from small companies, startups, and Fortune 50. So we see all kinds of different environments, large scale, enterprise, and everything. But Jordan does something a little different, right? You do more incident response.
Yeah, so my role at Rapid7 is I deal with digital forensics, incident response, and I also help build out incident response programs. So I do higher program development. I'm really jaded. I think everybody is wide open to be attacked, and everybody wastes money on a whole bunch of tools that they don't need to spend money on. So this talk actually started from Guillaume and I basically having a rage fest on the phone, and it was me screaming about a whole bunch of things, and then we came up with this talk.
Because we figured since he sees all the companies that get breached and he sees how it really happens, and I see how the companies try to prevent stuff from happening, we can see, does that make sense, right? Are you buying tools that will prevent the real attacks, or are you just buying stuff and adding stuff? So what we did was we built a story, which we'll look at going backwards just to begin with. And just for fun, does anyone here consider themselves to work more in a security than IT role? All right, one person. Great. You'll probably see that the timeline doesn't really make any sense. It's just because it's going to be easier to refer to. I guess unless your attackers were on meth, that's a really short timeline. So, which probably happens, right? Attribution. So we made a fake company called ASNA, which stands for Acme
Steel and Anvil.
Steel and Anvils, right? I always forget that. By the way, we don't know anything about metals, so everything we're going to say, like if there's like one person that really knows how metals are built,
just ignore that fact.
It's
just a story, okay?
Come and see us after. We just pick something. So at 7 p.m., that company's intellectual property is stolen. And in the case of manufacturing, we have a lot of companies in manufacturing. You have a lot of security issues, and you have a lot of business issues that make it even worse, right? So you probably get stuff built in China by third parties. You probably have a lot of legacy systems. So it's not easy for you, but at the same time, your IP is what's most valuable for you because you make these anvils, and they're great because of your special alloys, the process that you use to make them maybe allows you to make them cheaper. So once that leaks, that's actually really easy to replicate. So if we continue going back, then a few hours before that, their MRP database was accessed, and that's where all that IP lives. So MRP is Manufacturing Resource Planning.
Yeah.
I'm amazing with acronyms. You'll see that through the through the top, right? Now, before that happened, in many breaches, we see people going towards domain admin privileges so they can then just act as a regular sysadmin and do what they have to do without using exploits and exploiting vulnerabilities. So maybe Jordan, you can describe that, right? That's a really common.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm assuming most of you have a mixed environment. Is anybody purely Mac in here? Okay.
We sent the survey. Thanks a lot to those that filled it up. We'll show some of the results, but one common theme was almost everyone that answered uses Active Directory on top.
Yeah, so what we see a lot of times is it doesn't matter what the initial attack vector is. What they're always trying to do is do privilege escalation. And they always want to get to the highest level of privileges that they can. And most of the times they're trying to actually use the admins, right? You don't want to create new accounts because that creates noise. So you want to get legitimate access to legitimate users and use that. And to get there, a lot of times we see starting at one point and moving laterally, right? So you start, you attack somebody, you get local admin, whatever, you get root, et cetera, and then you're going to lateral over. But before you can get any of that, you have to dump something. You have to get something on a system so that you can start doing your lateral movement and start doing privilege escalation. And that's, I mean, just about in every breach that I've worked, it's always the attack vector, right? You start small and you move up the chain. It's pretty common. If anybody is familiar with like the kill chain or any of the attack life cycles, you'll see that over and over and over again. And the reason why is because it works.
And for the lateral movement portion, for those of you that have hybrid environments, you have some Windows, you have some Mac in the environment, we see that happening from one operating system to the other. We see that more and more. Like Mac is going to be breached first. People are going to try to move to Windows systems, or probably more often the other way around, right?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of times we'll see they'll bounce from OS X to a Nix to another Nix box to a Windows box. It doesn't really matter. You just keep moving through. So it doesn't matter if your environment is completely heterogeneous. They're still gonna lateral.
So right before that lateral movement happens, you typically have some malware that's executed on a machine, and that malware is pretty often downloaded by a dropper, which is just a simpler piece of malware, right? That doesn't really do anything malicious. It just goes out and grabs what it needs. And you see 24 minutes right before that, someone just received a malicious email. Why is there 24 minutes in there? The guy was probably just grabbing coffee. It's 9 in the morning, and then he clicked on it. And before that, everything was fine. That company thought that this is the kind of stuff that happens to others, and they thought they had a pretty good security program because they spent a lot of money on different solutions. So why is that? So having seen a lot of security programs in a lot of companies, I would say I could just describe it by its next gen and bourbon or Kool-Aid or something like that. People buy a lot of stuff. And what you see there is a ball of wild turkey and a Palo Alto firewall that I just happened to have on my desk. So nothing against them. It's just, I needed a really good photo. So people buy a lot of stuff and install it. And sometimes not only is it not as effective as they think it is in the configuration that it's deployed with, but it's even worse, right? If you think about DLP appliances, does anyone use data loss prevention software or appliances around? So that's one thing that, and plausible deniability, does anyone think someone they know uses DLP? I don't know if you don't want to tell us some secrets about your job. But if you think about DLP, what is it? It's an appliance that has access to all of your data that comes pre-built with the rules to search and find the data that you think is important to you, right? So if someone could get access to that, it's like, okay, I got everything that I need. So if you add all of these pieces, you got to be sure that they're actually useful. Otherwise, you're just increasing your attack surface. The thing is, most companies don't have huge security teams, and most companies also don't have a lot of very security-oriented people working in IT or development. So it's really attractive to them to just buy something that is supposed to fix an issue, right? And the vendors will always say, well, this is like silver bullet, just buy that, you'll never be hacked again or whatever. But there's always a little star right next to that, right? Titanium. So before we continue with that story and then go in the other order with some more detail, I just want to go over we sent a quick survey. First of all, 38% of people said they would be offended if Jordan said OS X, and he already did. So that is good. I was expecting a higher number from a Mac conference. Most of you are in environments with hundreds of machines. So there's a few people that said they had less than that, and a few that said they had thousands of machines. But it seems like everyone has enough machines that you have to manage them centrally, and you'll have the same issues as the people that have more. Maybe you just have less money. I see that the really large companies that have, let's say, 50,000 computers, they have more ease to buy the software, get the right resources to get things done. Sometimes if you only have 1,000 machines, you have the same problems, you don't have the same resources. Most people here seem to use OS X Windows, many browsers. That was really common across the board. Everyone uses Chrome. Almost everyone uses Firefox, Safari, or IE on top of that. A lot of people use Active Directory, which is something that we see in a lot of the enterprise breaches that we investigate. And something that I thought was really interesting was I had a question on like, how would you rate your security team? There were a few zeros, so the average is 6.5, but I was actually impressed. It seemed like most of you like your security teams, which is not always what we hear when we go to see clients, right? We hear a lot from IT teams that feel like their security team is just, trying to check boxes because they're really compliance focused, or they don't provide solutions, they just say no and they don't help. So I'm really happy to hear that. I guess it means that
you didn't have negative numbers, so.
The culture is changing. So the first step was the email. So if you remember, that was the email that was received, and then 24 minutes later, the dropper was executed.
So just with this, phishing is one of the most common attacks that we see, and it still works. It doesn't matter what platform you're on. It always works. You can use spear phishing, whaling, whatever you want to do. You can just do a massive campaign. It still works, and I would say half of the instances that we work on, it's like drive-bys and really good spear phishing emails. So that's a very simple thing for people to correct, is just actually educate your users. Like, who uses a .biz actually? What like legit company uses a .biz, right? So there are things like that, like just teaching them like, hey, why are you going to a .ru.biz or something like that, or a .biz, right? So we see that all the time, and you wouldn't have had to spend $50,000 on incident response with me if you would have just listened to Guillaume. So,
but to be honest though, sometimes it's really easy, it's a .biz. Sometimes it's actually really hard. If it's targeted, it's really going to look like a real email, right? So the typical defenses that we see in the enterprise, everyone's got some kind of anti-spam, right? Maybe you're using Google Apps, Office 365, comes with your cloud service. Maybe you redirect your email to some cloud service that does spam filtering. That's good against non-targeted attacks. It's going to reduce the noise, but that's pretty much it. Mail antivirus, pretty much the same thing, right? Some people have it as a part of their mail service. Some other people run it in-house. It's the same thing, right? It's going to catch the stuff that we know about. If it's targeted, probably won't. Endpoint antivirus, I don't even think we need to talk about that. I'm sure people have their own opinion on AV already.
did anybody see the exploit that was dropped yesterday?
No,
Which one?
semantic. Yes. Which one? Yes. Well, that's.
It was a whole 24 hours.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the thing, like, as he's already pointed out, we see a lot of times like people start putting more and more tools in. It's really just adding to your attack surface area. Attackers are starting to go after the tools that you're using to protect yourselves. We see like, Windows servers that are used for patch management and all of that. We've seen those used to actually push their malware. We've seen other tools that are used for management, like I don't want to keep naming names of companies, but think of anything you're using to push or control machines. We see those also used by the attackers. So what you guys are using to make your lives easier, we see the attackers use those as well. So it's not just security tools, it's automation tools, et cetera. So we see those used all the time in attacks that are targeted, and they usually know your infrastructure better than you do. I've actually had a client ask for the network infrastructure map that the attackers used so that they could actually update theirs. So it does happen.
Then on the maybe slightly more advanced scale, you have a lot of companies already use technologies to do sandbox execution. A lot of these also support Mac right now. Again, this is maybe slightly better than regular AV, but if it's something that's targeted, probably won't find it. And the reason for that is we just talked about the dropper. The dropper is a really small application that just goes and gets something else. Might not be able to look at that, and sometimes there's pretty important configuration issues which we'll talk about. Almost every company that we see that's of a certain scale does some user awareness. The problem is most of them do it for compliance purposes, and it's not really useful, right? So if you have user awareness and it's just like this race to clicking next, 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 so you get to the quiz, so you can say, no, I won't put my password on a sticky note, and it runs on Flash, I'm not sure you're gaining anything from a security perspective here, right? Might as well just delete Flash and not do user awareness. So the quality of user awareness is typically not super high. So I'm not saying user awareness is not useful. It just, if you're doing it for compliance, do it for compliance, keep it short, keep it simple. But if you really want to train your users, it's going to take more than that.
Does anybody actually do their own phishing campaigns against their organization in here? I got a couple. That's actually one of the best things in actually our company, our organization. When we have mass emails sent out that have an attachment, most of the people send it immediately to our phishing, and we actually have to have our internal security team go on a whiteboard, do a video, and say this email at this time from this user was actually legitimate. But that's
you just told everyone.
But you know, that's the thing is user awareness can be effective if you're doing it properly, and you know, we can stop a lot of the breaches by, again, simple things like that, but it doesn't happen. Most of the people just click, okay, yeah, I'm HR, I need to open this resume, or I'm accounts receiving, I need to see this you know, billable or whatever.
And on Mac, obviously you have Gatekeeper and XProtect, which again is it's going to help, right? Gatekeeper, the file's going to have to be signed, or someone's going to have to right-click on it to execute it. And we see a lot of breaches where the malware is actually in an encrypted zip or whatever, and there's many steps you have. It's like, open the zip, decrypt it with this password that's in the email. So people actually do go through quite a lot of trouble to run malware on their machines. So if the email says you need to right-click this file to run it, most people would. And then, you know, obviously XProtect, kind of like endpoint AV, it's only good against what it knows about, right? Yeah. So that email, right? There's different types of email that we can get. Like, we see a lot of SEO scams, right? This is not really technical. It's just more like it's just a scam, right?
Yeah. So this goes back to like the user awareness training. Like, I know a lot of people are like, oh, that sucks. It never works. Well, sometimes it can be, you know, pretty helpful. We see a lot of times where people will go, they'll look on somebody's LinkedIn, they'll find other aspects of them, they'll do their own research on whoever they're going to attack and say, oh, I know this company works with this company. I'm going to send an email saying that I'm this person. You know, I'm this comptroller, sending it to this CFO. And there's no malware that needs to be involved. It's really just a very complex scheme that they're using. And I've seen amounts as high as $860,000 wired to the wrong bank because it was a really good phishing campaign. And there was no malware involved. They called us in, they're like, find the malware, they had to know this. No, really, they just sent some good emails and registered a fake domain.
So we're not really going to talk about those much. I think your best protection against that is just financial controls, right? Make sure that a single person can't wire, you know, $1 million in 2 minutes. Could also be a link to something that's malicious. And in our case, it's an actual attachment. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference if it's a link or an attachment. It does make a difference on what security controls will apply, but the executable in the end, or the Word document in the end.
Yeah, and we're seeing macros used, and we're seeing links and phishing campaigns used against OS X as well. So it's not just a Windows issue. We see it as, that's why we're bringing it up, you know. But I mean, we've seen it happen so often that it's like, all right, seriously, people, like, stop clicking on crap, right? If you did that, you wouldn't have to pay us a bunch of money to come in and fix it and tell you what you did wrong.
The government purely sends out things about, you know, about helping your community and stuff like that. It was crafted like with the same verbiage that you would see, except it's like an external link.
So for the recording, the comment is just the phishing campaigns are getting very precise, and they actually really look like legitimate emails. We see more and more of that, and the more targeted it's going to be, the more likely you are to click on it, right? If you know who my boss is, you saw that, let's say on LinkedIn, you know I'm going to be here at this conference, and you send me an email coming from my boss saying like, oh, are you still at the Mac conference? Can you do this thing for me? That really looks like something that's legitimate, and yet all that information is public. Now, Jordan just mentioned macro, so we see more and more macro malware on Windows, and I think there's no reason why it couldn't start happening more on the Mac. There's probably, right now it's probably just a economic driver for the people that make the large-scale campaigns, that they just target Windows because there's still a lot of them to infect. But the thing is, on Windows, you actually have a lot more options to control that, right? So Office on Windows is extremely configurable, right? There's options to make sure that macros on files downloaded from the internet will not be executed. And when I say not executed, it won't prompt the user saying, do you really want to run that macro? Because as we said, if the person thinks they need that file to work, they'll run the macros, so you can't prompt them on files that are coming from the internet. That's really easy to do on Windows. Office hardening on Windows in general is very, very precise. You have almost too many settings, but you can do things like disable. There's so many features in Office, especially on Windows, right? It can still open files from WordPerfect, can still open Word 95 files and things like that. That's all stuff that there might be a vulnerability in that at some point. But if you disable it, you just buy yourself some time. So when the patches come out, you can deploy them, and you're buying yourself some time. And also on the Windows side, there's Microsoft EMET. I don't know, is anyone familiar with EMET? All right, there's a few that's pretty good. Like even in a more Windows-oriented environment, it would have been the same ratio. Microsoft doesn't seem to be getting the word out super well, but it's actually a great free tool that they have to secure your applications and mitigate some of these issues. So just to give you an example, on Windows, that's one of the folders that you have for configuring Office. If you see that first option, block macros from running Office files from the internet, that's a cool option. You just enable that. It doesn't break the macros that your accounting department has, right? Because every accounting department basically built an ERP out of Excel macros, so you don't want to break that. So you have a lot of features, and then you can do things like whitelist specific folders. You can say there's only macros on documents that are signed. We see that in finance. We use that where they actually sign these documents because for integrity purposes. If you run a bank on a macro, it better be signed, basically, is what I'm saying. Now, on the Mac, that's what you have, right? There's like one option that says, warn me before opening a file that contains macros. And we know what happens when you warn the user, it just slows them down and it doesn't change anything. Now, at least 2016 is sandboxed. So that should make things much harder for anyone who's trying to attack you. If you're on 2016, unfortunately, some stuff that you're trying to get done is also much harder on 2016. But have a lot of people deployed it yet? Or are you still mostly on? All right, so that is really good. That actually makes a huge difference. From a macro, you can call AppleScript. And from AppleScript, you can call some of the libc stuff. You can do system calls, so it can get pretty crazy pretty fast, right? So there's this framework called Empire. It's basically a post-exploitation framework for Mac. And it's got many different options. Well, not just for Mac, but it's got many different options for Mac. So one of the things it can do is it can allow you to embed Python commands in a macro that will just run in Word 2011, let's say, and that gets executed right on the system. So you can imagine making ransomware for Mac in the Office macro would actually be pretty easy on 2011. 2016, it should actually be harder. It doesn't mean that it would be impossible. Maybe at some point you'd get a prompt saying, do you want to allow Word to read that folder or something like that? And then again, if there's a prompt, there could be an issue. But just that should be a good enough reason to focus on deploying Office 2016 pretty quickly. In fact, that's pretty much the only thing you can do on the Mac side for now, at least on the endpoint, right?
Yeah. So, we talk about certificates. So we've actually seen, like right here, friends of ours work at Trend, and they found that, so this is more Windows-based. Originally, this talk was Windows-based, but we're seeing people use stuff like creating certificates to make it actually execute. So I'm not going to walk you through, guys. You guys can read the entire thing. But as we stop more and more attack vectors, they become craftier, right? That's how it's always worked. It's always been cat and mouse. Now we see that somebody will drop an HTML web page that you go to and visit, and then it'll run AppleScript, and then because it's running AppleScript, boom, now they're gonna drop in and run some Python, and now they've got a C2 with you guys, and they're using actual real encrypted communication channels for their C2 traffic, and guess what? They're dropping this across a bunch of different platforms. So not only they're attacking Windows and Linux, if you hit it, they also hit the Mac platform, and now guess what? Now they can expose all of your systems very quickly and lateral very quickly.
So just to show you really quickly what Microsoft Emmet does, which it doesn't have a direct equivalent on Mac yet, but what you see with the red desktop is an old version of Office. It's not patched. As soon as it opens that malicious file, you see on the left there's a Metasploit screen, and there's a shell that gets established, and because it's super old, crappy Windows XP machine, the person is going to be able to elevate privileges really quickly. Now with the green screen, what happens is Emmet is there and has some mitigations, and you see just killed Word really quickly. So what it does is it allows you to enable things like data execution prevention, memory randomization on apps that were not built with it, and then it kills the app when something crazy happens. But my point is, it killed the app, that's fine, but it also generates some data. So you can do SSL pinning for it, or you can do a lot of different things with it. What's really interesting is you want to look at the data it generates. So on Windows, you would know, for example, this is what would happen if someone was to hack a certificate authority and make a fake certificate for rapid7.com, and we detected that. We'd get an event from that. So I don't know if was anyone in the, what was the talk called? Building Defensible OS X Systems? All right, so he talked about a lot of the different logs that you can use on Mac, and one thing that would actually be really important for you to look at is everything related to application crashes. So either via getting the actual logs or using OS Query or something like that, because we see exploits that will crash the app even though they executed properly. So if you know who your targets are, like for example, sysadmins or finance, and you start seeing that their browser crashes more often than usual, that might be something that's worth investigating.
Yeah, like just last week we worked a case where one of the best indicators we had was actually a crash log from Office crashing when the exploit ran. So we found the malware eventually, but one of the quick things was like, well, why did this RTF file crash everything, right? That was a quick indicator, and then we started digging from there. But that's the thing, if you start taking your logs and actually reading what your log data gives you, exploits aren't perfect, right? They're sometimes they're dirty, sometimes they're elegant, but a lot of times that kind of crash data can be very valuable to you. And like I said, this is all stuff that we just see. Like last week, I just saw the exact same thing happen. So
there's a lot of other free tools that you can use to prevent that kind of stuff from happening, right? So we said it could also have been a link. Everyone who answered the survey said they use Chrome. Most browsers have similar configurations. Actually, Safari is getting better and better at like disabling the plugins out of the box and all of that. But what's amazing about Chrome is the configuration on the Windows side and on the Mac side is actually the same. On Windows, you can use GPOs, and on the Mac side, you can deploy profiles. But just doing something like enabling click-to-play and then deploying a whitelist of websites where you want Flash to run automatically, like maybe that user awareness website that we just talked about earlier, makes a huge difference because a lot of the malware that we see coming in through the browsers are using, let's say, ad networks. They're using stuff that the user won't even necessarily see the prompt to run Flash when they load that page because it's going to be like a little pixel somewhere. So that's actually extremely useful in denying the execution of any outdated plugins. Just doing this is probably more useful than a lot of the software security solutions you can buy, right?
does anybody have Flash disabled on in their environment right now?
We don't push it.
Soon.
All right.
Yeah. So Flash, Silverlight, all of those, Java, all of them are used. It's a really simple thing to stop a lot of the attack vectors.
And then pretty much everyone already owns some kind of proxy, firewall, some monitoring solutions, but sometimes the configuration that they're using is not ideal, right? So the first one is unclassified websites. If you pay a lot of money for a service that tells you if a website is malicious or not, or is it advertising, is it gaming, whatever, you should definitely be able to block unclassified websites. If you can't because there's too many false positives, well, that's a huge problem, right? Because when someone attacks you, they don't just go and hack a site that's already classified as malicious to target you, right? They just get onto a site that was previously well trusted, they hack someone else's system, so you have to block that. If you can't, I would suggest looking at different options for what you're using for proxy. I would say I'm from Montreal. One thing I noticed is if you're in a multi-language environment, some databases are much worse than others because like the French websites, for example, some vendors, it's really bad. But by shopping around, you can find something that's pretty good. Then the recently registered domain names, if you have anything that's able to look at that and block it, that will also make a difference, right? You probably don't have a big business reason to allow DNS queries to domains that were registered like 4 hours ago.
And
Pretty rare that this is useful. Sometimes it happens, but that actually is something that's always used by malware, right?
yeah, I mean, just like those, like we talked about, like the CEO scams or the CFO scams, those a lot of times are a very similar name to what your company is, right, and or organization is, and they'll use that. Well, guess what? That site should be unclassified. There's no real purpose for you to go to that website, and so a lot of companies try to buy all the variants or anything like that of their domains. But we see it all the time that there's something some variable that you didn't think about, and then guess what? That's what they use. And if you're blocking that in email and you're blocking that, you're going to stop a lot of C2 traffic. Also, like the unclassified sites, it's going to stop a lot of.
Can you define C2?
Oh, command and control. Sorry. So when I say C2, it's a command and control server. So when we drop a rat or remote access Trojan, like the Empire one that we just referenced, when I drop that, I'm going to use a website and I'm going to have that communicate out back to my site so I can give it commands so I can run it, right? So I can do a shell on you guys and then I can steal all your data after I start lateraling to where I want to get to. But again, if you block that in email and you block that for the DNS queries for those sites, you're going to stop a lot of those attacks. Or even if the attack does come through, you're going to stop a lot of the traffic that's going to go outbound to exfiltrate your data.
So this is something that most enterprise networks that we see, they already have what's needed to do that, but they don't necessarily do it. And in fact, that sounds really obvious, but blocking attachments in email, EXEs in email, we still see that working pretty often. Sometimes they block zip files, but they don't block encrypted zip files, which is kind of ironic because the encrypted zip files are the only ones they can't actually scan, right? So go back through that. Try to email yourself a bunch of different like DMGs. Try to email yourself JavaScript files. Try to email yourself a whole bunch of stuff that you should never email to yourself, and then block that. And it's the same for end users, right? Especially on Windows, people just have so many different agents that are running on the machines. Like let's say Adobe Updater just goes out and grabs it. You want to block your regular users from just downloading EXEs, especially in more controlled environment, right? So in finance, if you're in a bank, there's no reason for a user to be able to download an EXE.
Or a DMG.
Or a DMG or whatever. Just be careful when you start blocking that, because we've seen cases where people just started doing that, but their entire patch management strategy relied on some agents downloading EXE straight from the internet, so you gotta be careful. Somebody
made a recommendation to a client that actually had
I told
issue.
them to block it, and they did, and they're like, oh, Adobe is out of date. I'm like, oh my God, should have thought of that. And then the other one is link rewriting, right? If you have anti-spam, mail antivirus, anything that allows you to rewrite the links that people are gonna click on, it actually makes a huge difference. So remember that 24-minute delta. If in those 24 minutes your AV now has the definitions to know that what's going to be downloaded is malware, by redirecting that link through their platform, you just bought yourself a few minutes there. And we've seen a case where a company with offices all over America, Europe, and Asia, they were getting more like the more Eastern you were, the more malware you'd get. Just because of the time zones, right? People wake up earlier, the definitions are not up to date yet, and so they were getting a lot more malware, let's say, in London and New York. So just one simple thing that we did was we enabled link rewriting to make sure that everything that was in a link would get scanned as the people download it, and we also delayed the delivery of executables because they had a use case where people
attachments, not executables.
Yeah, well, of attachments in general, yeah, by 20 minutes or so. And that made a crazy difference, but like 90% reduction on like off-the-shelf, not very targeted malware, but just a new variant of it. It made a huge difference.
And when we were talking about link rewriting, like a lot of products out there, what they'll do is, let's say like we just talked about, like you could have HTML that runs AppleScript, and then that's how they're going to pop your box, right? Well, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, this link, you're going to click it, and then it's going to go through a sandbox, and then you're in that environment, so you're not actually executing it on your system. So there's some of the stuff that we can do there, and it really is effective. And I've seen it work plenty of times. But again, this is more commodity stuff. That's not as targeted as what we were talking about, the targeted attacks. That's when we say commodity, that's like here you've got a huge campaign that's using Dridex or the Zeus Trojan or something like that. But what it does take care of is a lot of those types of infections, which can be just as damaging to your organization.
Plus, you want to reduce the noise so you can focus on the stuff that actually requires investigation, right? So we've had that macro, let's say, that executed, and the dropper executes and downloads the actual malware on that very legit looking URL, right? So the thing with the dropper, right, we just explained before, is it's not as easy for any security software to detect that it's malicious, because
there's no real payload. I mean, the dropper is not a payload. It's just going to go fetch something, right?
It's not really more malicious than
it's kind of like a wget or something like that. I mean, it really, like,
well, that's a elite hacker tool, right? According
like curl.
Yeah.
No, curl is illegal actually. It's controlled.
Yeah.
So then in enterprise we see the same type of protections against that, right? People have next gen firewalls which are currently on sale, so I guess they're current gen firewalls by now, which are supposed to detect the malware, but again, it's just like what we were saying before. If it's targeted, it won't. They have proxies, endpoint AV, sandboxing technology. Again, that really is not going to help you in a case of a targeted attack. But sometimes it's even worse, right? You have that, and you think it creates a false sense of security. So something that we see actually really often is people don't do SSL decryption. They buy all that gear that's supposed to be able to inspect everything that comes around, but everything is encrypted and they don't look at it. So depending on the type of environment that you work in, it might be really easy to start doing SSL decryption. Let's say you're in finance, very controlled environment. If you're in education, like, you probably really don't want to start decrypting your students' traffic. So it really depends. But I would say if you're spending a whole lot of money on hardware and software to detect bad stuff going on the network and you're not doing it, at some point you might just as well stop spending your money, because then at least you'll have money, because everything's going to be encrypted. With Let's Encrypt, WordPress now has encryption. Everything is going to be HTTPS. So if you don't do that, then your sandbox can't execute these executables because they don't see it. It's very...
Is anybody in here actually doing SSL decrypt?
Poorly?
Well, so that's the thing, right? I wouldn't recommend just turning it on for everything, right? Because there's obvious issues with that from a privacy perspective. But depending on what your threat model is, it might not be realistic to think that someone is going to hack Bank of America just so they can use their servers to exfiltrate your data, right? For some companies, that might be a realistic scenario, like if you're in the defense industry or something like that. But for most companies, it's not. So you could say the banking website category, we actually won't SSL decrypt that. Where it gets really hard is with mobile apps, stuff that's starting to have SSL pinning, which is great from a security perspective, and bring your own device, right? You can't really push certificates to, well, at least you shouldn't push certificates to computers you don't own, so you can sniff the traffic that's coming out of there. So I guess in the hallway later we can talk about that. There's some solutions. Nothing is perfect, but you can improve that.
And when we talk about like DNS and proxy stuff, we see DNS all the time being used as an exfiltration path, right? We just did an example for a client who had app whitelisting. They had advanced endpoint, blah, blah, blah. They're doing network capture. They have, SSL decrypt, blah, blah. Well, they weren't decrypting everything for SSL like you were just mentioning, but we used a Xerox multifunction printer to exfiltrate data over DNS, and we had all the way through their entire environment. And this is we did this attack based on other attacks we've actually seen live. So, that's the other thing is monitor your DNS. If you see a spike in DNS, hey, maybe you should check it out. Yeah. And if you're not doing the SSL decryption, you're going to lose a lot of stuff as well. So there's a lot of things that you can just, simply say, hey, all SSL or all DNS has to go through these servers. It can't just go randomly out to 4.4.4.4 or 8.8.8.8, because that's another attack path where they're exfiltrating data, and it's really easy for them to.
Especially on networks that are really isolated. So I don't know how many people here have really isolated networks where machines can't even talk to the internet, but pretty often these machines can still resolve DNS, and that's kind of a loophole. It can start getting interesting. So if you're looking at your DNS logs, if you're using AD as your DNS servers, you just have to reconfigure it so you get a little bit more logs, and it's actually pretty good. Obviously Bind has logs, and everything's got logs that you can use. But as you can see in this case, that was an example that we just modified a little bit. The thing was just going out. It was making a bunch of DNS requests to something that we know is malicious. It was trying to pretend it's the Dell updater using the refer, which I guess if you only have Apple computers, you should probably find that to be extremely suspicious.
But this was basically what the dropper was doing. It was going over HTTPS. It was using it had DNS outbound. It went and grabbed the payload, and then the payload came down, and now they have a rat. Now they've got a shell inside of your environment. And I mean, we scrubbed this obviously, but this is what the kind of stuff we see, and that's what's really frustrating.
Like some IP addresses that don't make any sense.
Yeah,
and same for
obviously.
the dates, because we hired someone from CSI Cyber to make our slides. So once that dropper gets the malware gets executed, the next step is people are going to try to harvest some credentials, or as we say, they're going to try to Mimikatz you.
Is anybody familiar with Mimikatz in here?
All right, so Mimikatz is an open source tool, very popular for people trying to attack Windows environments. What it does is it's able to read credentials from Windows in memory, on disk, in like a bunch of different places, steal tokens. And it won't necessarily be the stock version of Mimikatz that people would use on Windows machines. It's going to be a modified version or something that does something similar. Now, what's interesting is on OS X, it's actually much closer. Well, it's Unix, right? So it's not like Windows at all. But Mimikatz can still be used to extract Kerberos tickets from your OS X machines, right? So if someone can copy that, they can actually get some AD credentials and then start doing the lateral movement. If any of you has the same local admin passwords, for example, on Windows and then on Mac, then you really have to worry about a Windows machine getting hacked into and that hash being leaked and vice versa. So obviously you really want to randomize that. But on the Mac, I would say keyloggers, the Kerberos cache that we just talked about, the keychain is also something that people will try to dump so they can.
Yeah, we see the keychain being dumped, and it's it's pretty trivial to do it. I mean, if you're a pretty
Once
decent
the
attacker.
privileges are elevated, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and look at, I mean, there were what 400 and some vulns last year disclosed. So for every vuln, there's almost always an exploit, right?
You know,
Yeah, but
CVE count as
I'm
a
just- I
measure
had to mention it,
of
you
software
know.
security is
Thank you.
stupid. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the other thing is like also like RCEs. We're not as worried about that as we are with, you know, like something that allows privilege execution. I don't really care if, you know, if there's an RCE versus privilege. I would rather get the privileges.
Remote code execution?
Sorry, yeah, RC remote code execution. Sorry, guys. But that, you know, like that's the other thing is people always look at when they're patching stuff to look at like the super critical things. Well, those aren't necessarily the most damaging to your environment. So that's the other thing is when you're talking with your security teams or talking about your patch management policies, is it doesn't matter if it's like the most critical patch. It doesn't mean that that's actually what the attack vector is going to be. So really, you know, patching your things is pretty important. And a lot of attacks again would be stopped by actually having real patch management policies.
So on Mac, also SSH keys and just the hashes of the passwords that are local to the machine are obviously going to be things that someone will try to attack. And again, in enterprise, typical defenses, it's always the same thing, right?
Is anybody using any like advanced endpoint technologies right now? Something
We
like.
bought everything.
All right, that's awesome. So do you have?
So you're secure, right? You're 100% secure now, right? Yeah.
But what
Feel
you
very secure.
well, that's half the battle. Now there's some free stuff that you should actually be doing, and I know the first one, everyone hates it, and everyone says so all the time. You just run as regular users. It's important on Windows. It's also important on Mac. You don't want people to be able to execute stuff as an admin with the account they're using day to day. If they need to use it for legitimate purposes, either make it temporary or give them a second account that they can't browse the web with or whatever. The last thing you want is the account that's used with the web browser to have local admin privileges, because then as soon as there's a bug in the browser, they get to the credentials, and then from that moment on, they'll just move with these credentials instead of exploiting stuff. As Jordan was saying, vulnerability management basics, it remains a very important part of security. You know, just deploy updates quickly enough. And as he was saying, privilege escalation bugs, sometimes there's quite a few privilege escalation bugs on OS X. I mean, it's not really rare. It's not as critical to patch right away on a single user system because you need something else to get there, right? But as soon as there's one, that means you're one browser bug away from having someone not only break into the machine, but elevate privileges. And if you're in a shared environment, you're in a school, you have many people logging into the same machines, or in a Windows environment, you have like a terminal server environment. They're actually even more important than the remote code execution, almost, like, I guess, especially in a school, because, you know, obviously students would never try to do some of that to get access to other stuff. So it's important to prioritize them accordingly, and not just say, we look at the CVSS score value, and like that's available in almost all security vulnerability management products, where we see a lot of companies that say, oh, if it's CVSS 7 or more out of 10, we'll patch it quickly, and if it's less than 7, then it's going to take longer. But what we see in reality is really few breaches are like a CVSS 10 that gets attacked. It's not this one big vulnerability, is people actually chain different smaller issues together, and people don't necessarily patch that fast at all.
Sorry, what is DA?
Domain admin. All right, so I was getting to that point. Domain admin on workstations, never ever log in with an account that has domain admin privileges, either on a Mac that's logged into AD or a Windows machine. The reason for that is, as soon as you do that, the credentials are going to be in memory. If that machine was compromised before or gets compromised soon after, that's going to stay in memory for a little while. So we see that being exploited a lot. The sysadmins are a really interesting target, especially because that's the nice thing about something like AD is it's single sign-on. I mean, you're logged in, you can do all of your stuff. That also makes it dangerous. So you really want to delegate more, but we'll get a little bit to that later. So they want to get these credentials. They want to get the local accounts. If they can escalate, they want to get the local admin privileges. And if they're lucky, they can maybe get some credentials that work on multiple machines, right? Has anyone ever heard of companies that use the same local accounts with the same passwords on many machines, right? I won't ask anyone to raise their hands. So that's still very common, and I think On the Windows side, now there's a free solution for that, which I'll talk about later. If you're responsible for Windows machines, you'll like that. If you're not, then you can tell your Windows colleagues to do it. But we really don't see a lot of like very common, typical defenses for local admin accounts. Some people will have like homemade scripts. Some of them are good. Some of them are kind of dangerous. Some people have like really often we still see people that have local passwords that are based on a variable, like it's a hash of the host name or something like that. They will figure it out. We see that in breaches where they break into one machine and they figure out that, oh, it's just a MD5 of the computer name or something like that. So that's definitely to be avoided. You don't want to underestimate the person that's attacking you because they might have, yes?
So what you're saying, there's no Mac equivalent of Labs?
I'm saying that Labs was finally released by Microsoft and
I've been looking for something like that.
Yeah.
And I still haven't found it.
so
I haven't seen anything that's free.
The comment was there's no equivalent to Labs, and we'll just show what Labs is right after. But basically, it allows you on a Windows environment to randomize the local admin accounts, and it's really easy to set up. It's really easy to delegate. I know there's some MDM that allow you to randomize the passwords. Of course, you can make scripts. You probably already have tools to do that. I just think it would be great if it was built in to the operating system more. But I mean, Labs was released like 15 years after they released Active Directory, which was kind of crazy. So until last year, it was the same on the Windows side. And there's like enterprise password management platforms that are great and have 2,000 features, but sometimes they're really expensive and really complicated. So you don't want to get that if you're just going to do that with it. Other issues that we see is logon scripts and deployment scripts. We still see credentials in there pretty often, right? On the Windows environment, you'll have people using preference extensions. Has everyone heard of group policy preference extensions before? That's a bunch of settings that you can push to Windows machines. They're not policies, they're preferences. And one of the options was you could configure your local admin password with that. The only problem is that password was encrypted with the same key for every Windows user. So the policies are readable by everyone on the domain. So as soon as someone could read that, they would have your local admin password. Microsoft released an update that just removed that feature. But that doesn't go and that was like the knowledge base article was like, this was a bad idea, we removed it. But it didn't go and delete the GPOs you already had created. And we still see some of these lingering around, and they're really easy to decode. There's a lot of tools to do that. And if you can do temporary pseudo writes for users that need it, build something in-house, or if you have something that can allow them to do that, that'll make a huge difference. So just before we were talking about Mimikatz, that's what it looks like. That's from a real breach, pretty much everything in there, except a few details that we changed, obviously. And it's in French, because it's a French guy that makes Mimikatz, so I always get a kick out of thinking about Jordan not understanding what the hell is there. But at this point, he's seen Mimikatz so often that it's pretty obvious. So it extracts clear text passwords or hashes that you can then go out and crack.
So yeah, to
someone
your
just
point,
mentioned Labs, right? So you stole my thunder. Thank you for that. No hard feelings. So Labs stands for Local Admin Password Solution, which is something that Microsoft released 15 years after releasing Active Directory, right? So NT 3.1 was released in '93, had domains, and since then there wasn't any easy way to randomize a local admin password on Windows systems out of the box. And since 2015 there is. It's free. Well, it's free, I guess. You're allowed to use it if you have a Windows license. And the way it works is it'll create 2 attributes for every computer that you have in your domain. And one of it is like a configuration value. The other one is the password. And it'll get randomized just like computer account passwords get randomized on Windows. So you can say every 30 days, I want that password to change. And what's great is if you have a team that works only in your Boston office, you can say in my Boston OU, this team can read that attribute. And you know these passwords are going to change every 30 days, and then you don't really have to worry about it too much. I guess the only issue here would be if your workforce never shows up at the office and never VPNs in, that it's still very, like everything AD related, it still relies on connectivity to domain controllers, right?
Is anybody randomizing their local admin passwords right now? Okay.
And who is doing it with something commercial that didn't require them making scripts?
Well, we bought CyberArk.
Well,
We just don't use it.
Can I buy those licenses from you for like $5?
Yeah,
All right.
if only.
That's a good example of something that's got a lot of features. It's pretty cool. but it's not easy to implement. And if you get it, you need to spend the time to do it right. Yes.
We're using a product called Password Manager Pro,
Okay.
and it lets you go in and make that a one-time only password. So as soon as that user logs out, it changes it.
All right, so the comment was Password Manager Pro, is that how it's called? Allows you to set a password that can only be checked out and used once and then gets changed, and that will make a huge difference. You know, in Windows environments, we see it all the time where someone breaks in, they use Mimikatz, they find the hash of the local admin password, and then they either do a pass the hash attack to move laterally, or they just break that password and then it's game over. So that's a very, very important security control to implement.
We had a pen test this past summer that was the main, that exploit you talked about.
The pass the hash,
We still had
right?
the GPOs.
Oh, the preference extensions, yeah, it's
And they
still quite
tore us
common.
a new one in less than a day from outside to full domain access.
Yeah, so that's what, you want to make it a little harder to get there.
Yeah, I mean, like it's like you're saying, like just like pen testers do it. The really good attackers, they're going to move through your network very, very, very quickly, and they're going to do it systematically, and you're not going to notice it because they're doing real legitimate logins. And we see people using. I mean, I don't want to get ahead of our talk, but I mean,
That's all you do, talk about like 3 slides in advance, right?
but yeah, I mean,
Why don't you describe lateral movement?
yeah. So, but
It seems like an interesting topic.
yeah, Guillaume hates me. But
Waiting for you, Jordan. Don't listen to him.
yeah, I'm supposed to just stand up here and look pretty because I have better hair than he does. So, yeah, but
Just wait until the end, man.
yeah, so with the lateral movement, though, you know, we're talking about randomizing the local admin passwords, things like that, but it doesn't matter. If you're connected to some sort of centralized system that is managing your passwords for your users, I mean, it's pretty rare that we see an environment that doesn't have some sort of centralized management, right? So you either have like Active Directory or some sort of LDAP thing, right? And we see them, all they want to do is grab as much as they can, as quickly as they can, and they typically target you. I mean, when we see the attackers, I've actually been in an environment where we were watching them and they were lateraling using the domain admin's password to lateral to the other machines that they wanted to grab. And we actually saw it in real time. We saw the command that they issued to do it. They use an IPC share. But that's the thing, like attackers, all they do is they find the easiest access point and then they just keep moving over and over and over until they get where they want. It's what works, it's what happens, and it's always gonna happen until you start preventing it.
And for those of you that have like thousands of users, one thing that actually works pretty well is a lot of people lock out accounts after so many attempts. Some people monitor like X amount of attempts on one specific account, but if you have 25,000 users, I guarantee I can use password $123 on every single user, just one attempt, and I'll probably find that one account that has access to AD, and then I can read these GPOs. So you have to think about how a real attack would play out, and not just go through. I think that's one thing that is pretty terrible sometimes with security teams, is urban legends and like best practices that are not necessarily based on how things happen for real, right?
Your attackers aren't going to use passwords that don't work. They're going to have the real passwords. They're going to dump them. They're going to either go to the keychain, they're going to go to memory, they're going to get it somewhere. They're going to use real passwords, and they're going to lateral using those legitimate user accounts. They're not like failed login attempts. Great, yeah, that's a compliance thing. That's not what happens when you have a legitimate attacker. They're not failing a whole bunch of times. You're not going to say, oh, all these users locked out because they're doing a brute force. Well, that's a script kiddie.
You might see that in a pen test, but in a
yeah,
real
I mean,
attack,
but that's going to
probably
be like a script kiddie doing that. That's not going to be somebody who's actually legitimately attacking you, trying to exfiltrate your data, trying to get at your intellectual property or whatever is valuable that you own. And like it drives me nuts when like, well, we monitor for somebody if they create domain admins or if they say create a new root account. They're not going to do it. They're not going to create some account that has privileged access because they already have the account that they need. So they're not going to create more. So stop. Yes, you have to monitor for them, but it's not really an indicator of compromise.
So lateral movement, what is it? What does it do?
Well, I mean, basically lateral movement is I sign into my machine and then I get popped, and then my machine, since it's broken into, it's going to go over to Guillaume because he has a lot more data that we need. And all they're doing is using a bunch of tools that a lot of times are tools that admins use. Like we see SSH, we see.
So on Mac, it would be more SSH or Apple Remote Desktop, even though that would be less likely. On Windows, it would be WMI, SMB shares, and
IPC, RPC, et cetera.
Everything like that, right? So basically the idea is, why can a regular workstation talk to your colleague's regular workstation, right? There's very few good use cases for that. And except for known exceptions, right? You know, if you use some kind of video conferencing app that needs to do peer-to-peer, that's fine, you can whitelist that. But on a Windows environment, why can my machine connect to a share on Jordan's machine, right? Like, is that where he puts like all the pirated music that he has and I want to download? Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's not a business application at all, yet very few people actually control that and firewall machines from one to the other. In fact, we see the environments where Wi-Fi is really popular. Sometimes it's a little better because people do guest isolation on Wi-Fi and on wired networks. Really few people do 802.1x authentication. It's like, oh, it's wired and like whatever. You have access to everything. So lateral movement, if you want to know if you are at risk of lateral movement on Windows, you want to use, I'll show it right after, a tool called psexec from sysinternals. It's a tool that allows you to execute commands remotely. If that works from a regular workstation to another regular workstation, you have a lateral movement problem. It should work from an IT workstation to a regular workstation, that's fine. Your SCCM server to your workstations, that's fine. But Mike's machine to Bob's machine, that doesn't make any sense. And on the Mac, that would be if you can SSH between these two machines.
Is anybody blocking SSH between their regular users right now? Yeah.
So we
if I'm in your environment, I'm going to SSH all over and I'm going to steal everything.
We see that really often on Linux environments, right? They'll break into one machine, they'll find some SSH keys, and then they'll scan the entire environment, and they'll try to connect to other machines with these same SSH keys. So you should definitely block that. And if you block it, monitor the failures at the firewall level, right? Because that could tell you about someone who doesn't know that it is blocked. So on the Windows side, local accounts, there's like a fake group on Windows called local accounts, which you can use to deny permissions, right? So there's user right assignments in Windows. They really look like the configuration pane on the preferences for remote login. They allow you to say, I want human beings to be able to log in via remote desktop, but my service accounts should only be able to log in as a service and so on. So you can put that local accounts group and make sure it cannot do anything that's remote. Blocking file shares, WMI, NetBIOS, SSH, VNC in a case of OS X and Linux that actually will make a huge difference. And again, it's just a regular administrator tool. So again, that's from another real attack.
This is pretty similar to the one I was actually talking about. So this is obviously in Windows, but this is all they have to do, and they're throughout your environment. It's pretty easy for them to go through and say, boom, all right, let's go, let's move, and they've got access everywhere. You can do the same thing in OS X environment.
So, except it would be more SSH based.
Well, yeah. But
so, on OS X, be really careful about remote login permissions. I don't really like the GUI for configuring the firewall on Mac. I feel like compared to what we get on Windows, like especially Windows 7 and up, it's getting really granular. You can make great rules in GPOs and things like that on Windows, but on Mac you can use PF, right? It might require a little bit more effort, but if you can just have a PF rule, you know where your workstations are, and you deny egress and ingress from the workstations on port 22, you've already done something that will make the next pen tester who shows up swear. Mm-hmm. And if a pen tester shows up and he's not swearing, then I mean it's no fun, right? You want to get the most out of your money. So the pen tester, they use tools like Responder on the Windows side. They'll try to exploit things that really often are related to Windows protocols, especially SMB. Mm-hmm. They'll use psexec. It's a legitimate system administration tool, right? So most companies won't have the AV delete psexec, especially if they've broken into a sysadmin's machine, right? Because it's a legitimate tool.
Yeah, psexec PowerShell on Windows are used all the time.
Yeah.
On the Nix side and the Mac side, we see them SSHing all the time. And just doing those little things that we're talking about, making sure that you prevent this, is going to make it a lot harder for lateral movement. It's going to make lateral movement a lot noisier.
Yeah. So simple step, just block SSH. That's going to be a great improvement. And if you want to, you can test like nmap port 22 on your network from a regular machine and start from there. Then once they have access to enough machines, obviously what they want to try to do is get the domain admin credential, so they can do that ideally by finding a machine where someone logged in as domain admin before. So the typical defenses we see for that, some of them are almost funny. One that we see pretty often is people monitor the domain admins group for modification, but 99%, total stat that I just pulled out of nowhere, but this is recorded, right? So let me put it on the record that 99% of attacks do not end up in someone creating an account called super legit account and just putting it in the domain admin group. They'll use an account that's already in there. The other one that we hear is we use multiple domains for separation. We still hear that. I think Microsoft is to blame for that a little bit, because in the early days of Active Directory, they actually recommended that you use Active Directory domains as a security boundary. Like, you have your forest, you have multiple domains, but in fact, the security boundary is really your forest. So think of any domain controller, anyone who's able to get admin privileges over any single domain controller in your environment, even if it's a read-only domain controller, because they're not that read-only, is able to take over the entire forest and every domain that's in there. That's the easy way to think about it. So domains are not security boundaries, the forests are. And no, you just sold a punch with a bad key stroke, Jordan. What did you do? So separating service accounts is really important, right? If you have tools that need to scan all of your machines, or you have tools that you use to deploy, and they have accounts, make sure that for different levels of security, you use different accounts entirely, right? So for example, if you had a tool to deploy software on Windows, make sure it only has the local admin privileges on the machines where it needs to deploy software, and never give it domain admin, right? Because the first thing that's going to happen is when someone runs that Mimikatz, what you're doing is you're basically leaking these credentials to every single Windows computer that you have. So on your domain controllers, you'll want to have a service account that's only used there. If you have some critical servers, you'll want to have one there where that entire idea of doing network segmentation, well, I guess you have to do credential segmentation now, because the credentials are really what the people go after. You really got to patch your domain controllers. Like, if you're not responsible for your domain controllers and you know they're not really patched, get after your Windows admins, because that's going to lead to someone accessing your OS 10 environment, because they're linked to Windows. Windows is really good at delegating permissions. You could actually have a domain with no domain admin. I've seen it in pretty big environments. It works. It's a lot of work. I would probably not recommend trying to get there, but there's no reason why you would need a lot of domain admins. And most of all, there's no reason why you should be logged in as a domain admin often. That should be a pretty rare thing. You can do almost everything. Some stuff is like delegating like the DNS permissions in Windows. Gets a little bit annoying, but it's doable. But just do the basics. Create separate accounts, right? If you're working on your Mac, you're logged into AD with a regular account, not domain admin. And that's more of a Windows thing. So link local whatever resolution. That's the thing that makes it work in Windows when you only use a short host name instead of a fully qualified domain name. That's really nice to do man-in-the-middle attacks and steal your credentials, and that's something you can turn off really easily. So I guess Ballmer should have been yelling, delegate, delegate, delegate. That would have been more appropriate for security. So the problem with AD, and we just touched a little bit on that before, is people have been using AD forever, right? Like, very few companies decided in 2015, oh, let's move from Novell to AD. Like, that happened a while ago. And one of the problems is it's really hard to replace your entire AD. So if you have like your Mac environment is binding there, you have some Unix systems that are connected to it, some stuff uses LDAP, whatever. No one really ever replaces their AD. It's really rare that these projects make it through. So the cruft builds up, and people are still pushing out old GPOs like we talked about before. And in fact, Windows 10 is actually pretty secure. The default configurations are not that bad, but we see a lot of environments where as soon as you join AD, people are pushing out the same bad GPOs they've been pushing out for 10 years, but it hardened Windows XP, but it doesn't really harden Windows 10. So on the Windows side, one thing that's really important is to understand what the effective permissions are, right? Because in LDAP, you can have like groups and groups and groups, and then you have like circular relationships, and everything goes crazy, and you don't even know what is a domain admin anymore. So that's something that is really worth understanding in your environments. And in fact, you don't need to be domain admin to understand that, because most of that is readable. So there's a PowerShell script that all the links for everything we talked about we have a website for the talk. It's evil.plumbing. So you can go check it out there. We'll have it at the end. What you want to do is you want to draw a map of who's in what group that gives them what access. So that's something you can do even as a regular user in your environment. You'll need a Windows machine because it's PowerShell. But try to understand who's able to modify everything that relates to your Mac environment, right? Like, who's able to modify the computer objects there, who's able to get to domain admin via whatever group. Sometimes we find some pretty interesting stuff. I think the worst that I've seen yet was major, we're talking like a multi-thousand people environment where domain users was in domain admins. So I didn't really need any of the tools before I just freaked out. But and now the great thing is when you remove that, everyone goes from local admin to not local admin, and you have like 10,000 users. You do that at once. It did not break anything at all. I would recommend like removing the group and then just going off the grid. Like you turn off your phone, you just run away.
No signal.
No signal. So another really interesting thing on the Microsoft side that you can reuse a concept is Microsoft calls them privileged access workstations. It's just the idea of building a machine where you do your administration from. And you have a stupid small link there. It's on the website at the end. I know you can't read that. You can use virtual machines. You can use separate physical machines. The idea is pick something that's secure enough for the environment you're in, but that's not too crazy, right? Because that's the thing with security. Like if I told Jordan, oh, you want to create a user in AD, you need to drive to Boston, go in a locked room and use the AD computer that can add machines. No one's going to do that. And sysadmins are really good at finding ways to get their work done. So on the Windows side, if you make it too crazy, someone's going to find a way to do
sysadmins become pen testers.
Run
we see that a lot.
Crazy things so they can do that on their machines. But what you want to do is make sure that people do highly privileged management operations from machines that are isolated and that can't get to the internet, right? So you want to force someone to break into something else before they move there. So no browser there, egress filtering, it can't.
Yeah, and that doesn't matter if it's whatever environment it is. It doesn't matter if you're doing Linux, if you're doing Mac, if you're doing Windows. Use jump boxes. If you're going to do anything privileged, anything that has a lot of access, make sure that you use jump boxes, or as Microsoft calls them, privileged access. Like you mentioned CyberArk. CyberArk has those features, but also monitor everything that a privileged user is doing. That's going to be one of your best indicators that something is actually occurring in your environment, is that privileged users are doing things that you're like, hey, this is outside of a change window, or hey, this is coming from, why is this machine talking to this machine, et cetera, why are they using root, et cetera. So look for those things and try to log those as best you can.
So I guess all we've been saying is really check privileges, make sure people don't run with elevated privileges for nothing, delegate as much as you can. Segment your systems. That's something that's still extremely valuable from a network perspective, but segment your service accounts. The credentials are getting more and more important to be segmented. Randomize passwords for any local account. They absolutely need to be randomized. And something we didn't really talk about is egress filtering. That's still something that is not as common as I would like it to be. Especially on servers, we still see a lot of people who don't do egress filtering on servers. So as soon as someone can break into, let's say, that database we were talking about earlier, if they can just connect back to the internet, it's super easy. But if they can't, what you're doing is you're forcing them to dump that database, move it to that privileged admin workstation, which also can't go to the internet, and then move it to
a so workstation. Your attack path is going to have to be like HR or finance, then over to somebody who's going to be a domain admin, and then has access to a jump box. And you go to that jump box, and then that jump box goes to where the actual data that you need is. And then you're making it that harder. The more steps
the attacker has to do, the more chances you have to actually detect that, right? Because incidents are not something you can avoid forever. Everyone's going to have incidents. The thing you want to do is just make sure it doesn't turn into a big breach. And hardening your systems is still very valuable. I would say hardening your web browsers is also something that's very important. Hardening Office, really valuable, but on Mac there aren't as many options as on Windows, though upgrading to 2016 would fall there. So for 2016-17, what I would say for your security programs, just like grab a shovel, fix everything with the stuff you already have, and don't try to get like any silver bullets, because there aren't any. And once you have that really strong foundation, then the different products that you can buy will help you address some specific use cases, and you'll get the most out of your money. And then if you get something like a pen test, after you've done all of that, then you'll get much better output, because there's not going to be any easy stuff, right? So that's what we would like you to do in the next year for the security of your environments. I have some special thanks to Adam for helping me translate some stuff from Windows to Mac. I've always been an Apple user, but I didn't know how people manage Mac in enterprise at all. So thanks to Mac admins and the security channel there for helping me out. And I would also like to thank Jordan for being so organized. And I would like to thank you for taking the time to attend. The slides and links are going to be there. The feedback link is right there. Our Twitter usernames if you want to complain to Jordan or tell me it was awesome. And I don't know if we have any time for Q&A because I think the screen crashed back there. I think it's got BSOB. Does it say 7?
Yeah.
Oh, I was looking at the other screen there. It's because I'm blinded by the projector. All right, so we have 7 minutes for Q&A, and the catch box is right there, so the questions are recorded.
Ready?
I only have one very serious question, and that is, could you explain your T-shirt?
Okay, my T-shirt is
Electronic Freedom Foundation is on the
well. So
frontier.
that's a Rapid 7 T-shirt that we made that says "Open source is magic," and we made them last year for DEF CON, and we were selling them and giving the proceeds to EFF, and they just went off the shelf like super quickly. It was ridiculous.
That's not Malwarebytes on the
No, that's Metasploit.
pardon.
Anybody else?
Thank you. Very, very important topic to address. Now it's said.
I mean, I can't just like ask, why doesn't my security team not do this? Because that's not good for my OPSEC in general. But why don't we firewall between subnets anyway?
Yeah, I mean, those little
Talk
things
about
though.
egress. Talk about egress. How about between subnets? How about between VLANs?
Yeah, I mean,
Anyone else wants the catch box? We can go on rant for a few hours right after if you want.
So-
that's basically our job. So
All of my users should change their password once a month or once a week. Which one's more secure?
Yes.
Now, my question is, how do you handle the privileged access type concept with web services like Salesforce, Google for Work, things like that? The idea of like the normal account being separate from the
yeah.
admin account.
So, well, to your first non-real question, since this is filmed, I would like to also state on the record that I think password expiration policies are stupid. That's it.
But SSL man in the middle is good.
Let's not get carried away. Now, for cloud environments, it really depends on the platform. So Google Apps is a good example where, you know, with Google Apps, you can log in via, let's say, SAML, right? Let's say you already have your identity platform. People they do single sign-on, they log in. That's fine. But then you have admins, and you have super admins, and Google still has passwords, right, in the back end. And you can't really prevent people, I think the super admins, you can't prevent them from logging in with the password. And that's a problem because sometimes with your SAML portal, what you're going to do is you're going to put some restrictions, right? You're going to say, if you want to log into Google Apps as an admin, well, you need to be on this network, or you need to be using whatever. Like all your policies are going to be around that. But if I know that password, I can be anywhere and log into Google Apps as an admin. So in these cases, I would say, first of all, make sure that like these super admin accounts and everything are different. They're stored somewhere safe. Use SAML. So have 2 accounts for that person. Right? One of them is admin. Use SAML and monitor. Google has logs that tell you if someone logged in with a password, and that should be a really, really important alert for you if someone just logged in with a password on Google. That's actually pretty scary. The only thing that I see sometimes with Google specifically is the logs are not real time.
yeah.
I had a case where a client called me on Monday saying, I had an employee in China last week, and then he just logged in from China this Monday, and he's not in China anymore. And as you can imagine, people are freaking out. Like, did he travel, use some compromised Wi-Fi or whatever? But then we realized that we just got the log on Monday for what happened on Friday. So I think there's no SLA on the logs. It's typically not that long, but I've seen it take up to 72 hours. But really important to monitor. And make sure all these logs from like Salesforce or any software as a service that you have, make sure you bring that back into whatever you use to do security analysis. Like if you have a centralized logging platform, really use these APIs. And if you need to, create like shared accounts that you check into something like we mentioned, like CyberArk or Password Manager Pro, I think it was. There's many different solutions there, like Lieberman, whatever. If you have to, do that, but try to keep them linked to an actual person and avoid generic accounts as much as you can, unless you can enforce check in, check out. Any other question?
Heads up.
Nice catch.
Have you ever seen a company that has really rolled out a heavy use of two-factor authentication and still be able to get past that, or is that kind of a cure-all?
Yeah, so the thing with two-factor authentication is you have to be sure that most companies will try to do it on everything that's on the external attack surface, like your cloud services or your VPN and whatever. So that's a nice first step. But we know most of the attacks begin with malware on a machine that's already internal, right? So you need, if you deploy, let's say, two-factor on your Windows environment, you need to be sure that it's deployed everywhere, especially on the machines where people can log in with privileged access. I've seen companies deploy it pretty widely, but there can always be either bugs or logic failures in how you handle things like how do you register a new phone? How do you do a password reset? And that's a place where some companies have issues where, oh yeah, we do two-factor, but someone actually managed to register their own phone.
Well, yeah, actually, that was an attack that well, I think that's where you're getting it from. But we just saw an attack where the actual real user had an iPhone, but they also had a self-service portal for two-factor, and then the attacker registered an Android device and was able to use the registration, so register their own phone, and then they were logging in as that user legitimately. And so that's one of the things that we saw, and then it happened, it was a month ago when we were talking about that? But yeah, I mean, so the same thing. And then what they did is they moved over, grabbed the API keys for their AWS instance, stuff like that.
But it still makes a lot of things way harder, right? Like if you had to concentrate on one thing that you're gonna put a lot of effort on after you're done with all the
2FA is very, very effective in making it hard. Nothing's perfect, right? There's always a way to do stuff, but I would definitely say that it's better than, that's one of the best things you can do for yourself.
All right, I just heard the music, so I guess we're done. Thank you, everyone.